Welcome back to the Phoenix channel. Today is July 4th, Saturday. Start with a beautiful panoramic here at the regular park I go to. Still getting outside, as I hope you guys are, getting that vitamin D in and doing at least 100 push-ups and 100 sit-ups, about 2.5 miles per day. So nothing too strenuous, but just trying to maintain. But with that said, guys, really thank you for tuning into this content. Want to start off by just observing the recent moves in Bitcoin, not so much from a price perspective, but more so from the investments and infrastructure build out that we're seeing here in the United States. And we're not seeing a lot of discussions about this from many crypto holders. I think many people are growing bored with Bitcoin and crypto in general, but in the background, under the hood, we're seeing a lot of movement, a lot of efforts underway to either secure Bitcoin by institutional organizations, banks, and others. And also we're seeing infrastructure, physical infrastructure build out. And most recently, we've even seen the likes of block.one investing in a mining operation of some kind with Northern Data. So those facilities, guys, if you look at them from a size perspective, are in the hundreds of megawatts, which I can tell you, being a power engineer, electrical engineer, that size, guys, it takes a significant commitment to build out, and it's not just block.one that's doing this. So it does raise some questions about ultimately who all are behind this type of a move. Is it exclusively private companies, or are we actually seeing what some people are calling a Sputnik type moment in the history of Bitcoin, where you're actually seeing, I would say, country players, entities acting on behalf of countries, actually building out these mining operations, because the sizes of them being in the hundreds of megawatts, some of them expansive to gigawatts, that's a huge size, guys. And most of the time that amount of power actually transverses through transmission lines, because there's not maybe a single source nearby that mining center to create that. So you're talking about lots of regulatory oversight, lots of design work, lots of cost, not only for the mining company, but for the utilities and everybody else involved to make something like that happen. So I guess what I'm getting at, guys, is no one just does that if they think that within a year's time or even 5 years' time that something like Bitcoin isn't going to thrive. It's no secret, guys, that that type of a size and that type of an investment, it essentially, and obviously nothing's guaranteed, guys, but it just solidifies my thesis that there's much more going on that we know about in the United States and all around the world, in fact. And even though the price of Bitcoin is hovering around $9,000, and a lot of people may frown upon that and say that Bitcoin should in fact be much more of a increasing in price during this time. If you go back to my previous videos, we had actually said that during this crisis we'd either see Bitcoin stabilize or perhaps Bitcoin go slightly down. So in actuality, Bitcoin is performing like Bitcoin should be performing, because what you have is a transfer of assets. I think what's actually going on right now with the amount of people out of work due to C-19, opinions about C-19 aside, we have 26 million people, if not more, out of work right now. And you have to believe that a vast percentage of holders of Bitcoin, okay, prior to, I would say, this half of the year into 2020, were mostly people under the age of 50. likely a vast percentage of them were under the age of 35. I think that's a fair assessment. I could be a little bit off, but majority of people who hold crypto are in that age group. Now, when you look at assets and who holds assets and how many assets they have, many of the people who hold Bitcoin are highly leveraged into Bitcoin, meaning when they are under some stress because of these sanctions by the government to stop going to work or businesses shutting down, seeing huge dislocations in the market. So outside of assets that are highly manipulated, such as stocks, real estate, etc., I actually think that many of these holders are selling their assets into the market to raise cash to sustain themselves, because a lot of people are out of work. Now, considering that, you'd normally actually expect a huge price down in assets like Bitcoin. But I think what's actually occurring is these institutions are scooping up these assets on the lowdown. Okay, they're low-key buying these assets up, and that's why you're seeing sort of a stabilization. On the one hand, you're seeing, I think, actual individual holders of Bitcoin going down, but you're seeing the institutional ownership of these assets actually going up. And at some point, those are going to find an equilibrium. But in the meantime, you're seeing what I think is a transfer. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I'm not a huge fan of that type of activity occurring on something like Bitcoin. But the fact of the matter is that is what's occurring because of the nature in which people hold their assets. That's just the way things are, how much they hold. We can't necessarily change that, and the stresses that they're under. So at some point, though, what's interesting to me is we're going to get to a point where the folks that are under that stress have exhausted their selling. I think it's mostly shorter-term holders of Bitcoin, because if you look at statistically, the longer-term OGs in Bitcoin that have been around since 2013, 2012 have not actually sold any of their Bitcoin. Very few have moved their Bitcoin. So the vast majority of this float, if you will, is actually from shorter-term holders, shorter-term speculators, which there's nothing wrong with. People have a right to do what they want to do. But all that Bitcoin right now is getting eaten up, and we're at the post-halving. So it's going to be very interesting once that selling pressure wanes on Bitcoin, what the price is going to do. And I think you're going to see a very highly, I think you're going to see a wild behavior, a wild price response to this demand, because now in concert with what I just described, with smaller Bitcoin holders basically being forced to sell, very similar to the way we're seeing in local governments, even here in Arizona, in fact, a lot of local businesses are being forced to sell their businesses and assets because the government is forcing them to shut down. Now, whether you agree or disagree with that practice or that decision that's not what I'm discussing here. I'm just stating the facts that businesses are going out of business and they're being forced to shut down. They're being forced to liquidate their holdings and their commercial properties. And I think over time, once the special hoops that some of these banks and governments have drawn up for real estate runs out, and a lot of the actual payouts and unemployment stuff runs out, if it does, before the election period, you're going to see more of that stress come into various markets. Bitcoin not being immune to that purpose, but it's going to be counterbalanced from institutional acquisition of these, unfortunately, because of the future being stuff like Bitcoin. So why this is interesting is we talked about in this video the demographics being most of the people who hold Bitcoin today are for the most part under the age of 35, and there's probably some type of a transfer going on with the short-term holders of the likes of something like Bitcoin. When you look at from a asset portfolio perspective in the United States, who actually holds the wealth? A vast majority of the wealth is actually held by boomers. I would say, and I don't have the statistics in front of me because I'm at a park, but I'm pretty well read in the sense that I track a lot of these financial metrics, and most of the wealth, 70%, if not more of the wealth in this country is held by boomers. So how I think this is going to actually play out is you're seeing these institutions right now acquire Bitcoin without telling the whole story or narrative or thesis on why they're doing it. And this is because they want to acquire assets like they always do for a low price. And then as the narrative and the storyline, they begin to develop their thesis and begin to justify their positioning on this, they start to communicate this to their clients to sell these assets to them while actually being in possession of Bitcoin for a very low price and selling it very high. And they can rinse and repeat just like they do with other assets. So actually that's what I think is occurring. That's one catalyst, maybe an unfortunate catalyst for something like Bitcoin, because you're going to see that percentage of wealth in the United States, which is probably 70% of the wealth in this country, who doesn't have a significant exposure to an uncorrelated asset like Bitcoin, they start to make their move and start to acquire these assets into, I would say, maybe as early as late Q4 of this year, or maybe sometime next year. You're going to start seeing discussions, you're going to start seeing publications from these large institutions to advise their clients on acquiring this stuff. You're also going to see that in the pension arena and the 401k arena, I think as early as next year. That is actually not that much time between now and then in terms of a time frame for this to occur. And the reasoning behind that, or the reasoning on why I'm saying that, is the parallels we're seeing in the mining space and the investments being made. So, and the time frames associated with that. Something is cooking here. These aren't the types of investments that just occur in the power space on a whim. They take years to occur. You're looking at data centers and other types of infrastructure coming in. And those things, based on the publications I'm reading, are stating they will be online into next year. So it all kind of lines up for that time frame, guys. And I would just say, if you're an OG holder or if you're a new holder, there are things you can do on your own to educate yourself and not get so stuck on price. Focus more on observing on what these institutions and high net worth individuals are doing. Don't focus on what they're saying, because that you're going to hear contradictions between what they're saying and what they're doing, and the same applies to countries. And I think that's what you're seeing right now. There's a huge distraction in some ways going on in many different arenas, but Bitcoin is one of those. So and similarly in terms of countries, you're seeing that, and you're seeing perhaps even a Sputnik moment where countries are going to start racing to develop the most efficient chips and technologies to gain some control or some influence on the network of Bitcoin. Now, no country's obviously going to just come out and say that. So they probably have some proxies that they're deploying to do this type of work. So that's my whole rant on Bitcoin, guys. Obviously, on the EOS space, work continues. Today, they've announced, block.one has announced that voice is going to be open to everybody to read. So that's pretty exciting news. and we're waiting to hear on the feature to allow users to post on voice without broadcasting their real name. So I will be looking to actually create some content on a site like voice.com, looking at more covering technical features to help the platform grow. But I don't necessarily want to do that with my real name. Some of us do have other types of jobs and other types of things, and maybe it doesn't make sense for us to just put ourselves out there like that. And also the fact that Voice is still a relatively young company, and as much as I like a company like block.one and Voice, you know, we got to be cautious on just moving forward in that way. So that would be my only criticism. That'd be my one criticism with Voice at this time, is what happened to adding that type of a feature so that users don't need to put their name on there. Beyond that, there's a lot of exciting stuff in terms of other tools that I think their CEO has announced they're going to start releasing into the fall this year. So that'll be exciting to see. Looking at, I have a list of features I have in mind I'd like to see, some kind of partnerships. So look out for those videos, and hopefully if they get that feature added on Voice, I can just make an article that spells that out as well. And beyond that, guys, what I've been doing and why I haven't been making so many videos is because I've been mainly focused actually on coding and mainly getting enough skills to develop some technology, some software, and it takes time. I mean, if you're a coder, you probably know that. If you've dealt with software development, you probably understand that. But for those that don't know, it's not just learning something like EOS IO. You have to learn all kinds of other technologies with that to make a full suite application. So for me, it means not only mastering JavaScript, which I did on Ivan on Tech. I did that course, guys. I did want to mention to you all that I've done that, and I recommend it for those that are maybe interested in that. I don't get paid from him. I don't have a link. This is just kind of my own take on things. It did help to kind of be consistent in terms of how I was approaching my training or my review or my ongoing work in this area. So I did that to start with, but my one critique for that course is they don't seem to have a React course. And if you're going to develop applications on mobile apps or other types of platforms, you know, something like React is almost like a no-brainer. You pretty much need that to develop your front end. So that wasn't necessarily there. You're getting that foundation with something like JavaScript in his course, but you really need to have both JavaScript, React. You probably need a little bit of database administration, something like MySQL or something comparable. And then you're looking at obviously something like EOS IO or another blockchain that you can develop, or maybe using something like the EOS Ethereum bridge that allows you to take Solidity code and move it into EOS smart contract type code. So that's kind of where I'm at. I mean, I'm going to focus more on the EOS IO when I cross that juncture, but right now, for the most part, I'm focused on my front end work, my APIs. Oh, that's another thing. You need to dive into a bunch of APIs to, for the most part, get your app to work, whether that's Google Maps or other types of listing services, which would be cool to see on something like Liquid Dapps, maybe with their market. But for now, a lot of us are using other third-party APIs to develop our types of applications. And it was really cool to see this week that the folks from WordProof, shout out to those guys, won $1 million, I believe, from the EU or somewhere in Europe. They had won a competition after taking Ivan on Tech's course. So there are people that are relatively successful in this domain. I'm looking to follow in that. Right now it's a one-man team, but obviously always looking for other people to learn with me and maybe create something special. So that's what I'm doing, guys, in addition to working my ass off like 50, 60 hours a week at work, just getting all these projects done during my day job. So I hope everybody's staying strong. And if you like this content, consider hitting the like button. Consider subscribing to this channel. This is Phoenix signing off. Have yourselves a happy 4th, and we'll talk to you later. Peace.